Sepharad, the ancient Hebrew word for Spain. It's a name that conjures up a culture which was scattered across southern Europe and survived for more than a millennium. It found its final flowering not in the gardens of Andalusia, but 2,000 miles to the east, here on the fringes of one of Europe's mightiest waterways. I'm standing on the shores of the Bosphorus, and behind me is what remains of the huge empire which sheltered the exiled Jews of Spain until it was destroyed in the final months of the First World War. On either side are two of the world's grandest places of Muslim worship, the Suleiman and Blue Mosques. And between them, guarding the entrance to the Golden Horn, is the powerhouse which fueled the Ottoman Empire for 5 centuries, Topkapi Palace. 500 years ago, from the doorway of that palace, there issued a welcome which put an end to 200 years of persecution.
The Ottoman government meant freedom for their religion, respect of their persons. All Jews that were molested during the Byzantine era could breathe again.
The conquest of Bursa and other places by the Ottoman has been considered as a salvation for the Jews, and they welcomed the Ottomans, and the very good relations started really at that time. Whereas in some places we were forced to exile, in other places we were welcomed with open arms.
It was that very benign influence of Islam. It was almost like a patriarchal society. It's almost parental. You know, there's a big father saying, you behave yourselves and then you can do what you want.
The Sublime Porte, the gate to the most powerful centre of government in the 16th century. Through this archway, past these elegant gardens, and up this cobbled street, was the Ottoman equivalent of the Quai d'Orsay or the Court of St. James's, where ambassadors waited patiently to negotiate alliances and arrange economic terms with the Sultanate. They had every reason to do so. The Spanish Empire might be spreading through the Americas and Henry VIII consolidating his supremacy over France. But the fiat of Suleiman the Magnificent rang from Hungary and Romania, through the Balkans, down into Egypt, and across the Levant to Asia Minor. This is the Sultan's audience hall, surrounded by mighty marble columns with a coffered roof painted in cream and gold. The receiving throne is 10 foot square and crowned by a tasselled canopy surmounted by a golden sun. In this Ottoman sun, Jewish diplomacy and commerce flourished.
It was a very highly respected minority that served well the interest of the rulers of the time.
The industrialist Isaac Alaton detects echoes of the high season of Sepharad in the Ottoman world.
The sultans have always been very friendly towards the Jewish minority. That is the reason why we look at it as the golden time of the Jewish community in the region.
Harry Ojalvo, a businessman and community leader here in Istanbul, has created a small museum in the basement of his offices to demonstrate the achievements of Ottoman Jewry.
They brought in the knowledge of steel, tinting, modern machinery, weaving. They brought everything with them because everything was made, but in a very primitive way. You see, but when they came in, they brought something with them, a heritage. What they had learned and given to the Spaniards, they brought with them.
Sephardic looms wove the cloth and Sephardic tailors made the uniforms for the Sultan's elite corps of janissaries. They also introduced modern ballistics, developed during the Italian phase of their exile. Suleiman's armies fought their way to the gates of Vienna, courtesy of Sephardic weaponry and financed by Sephardic venture capital. A Spanish visitor to Constantinople remarked, "Would that it had pleased God to drown them on their voyage here, for they taught our enemies most of what they know of the villainies of war. And if the Janissaries were wounded in battle, or picked up something undesirable in the brothels of Sarajevo or Ragusa, they would be treated by Jewish physicians. Jewish doctors were so highly prized by the Porte that the Sultan's physician had his own apartment here in Topkapi. Most celebrated of them all was Joseph Hamon. He was appointed to the post first by Bayezid and then by Selim. His diplomatic skills were developed here at the Porte, where he negotiated the peace between Istanbul and Venice in 1540. His scholarship was as formidable as his diplomatic skills. He wrote religious and medical textbooks, which were printed in the presses of Galata and Balat, and most of them in Ladino. The old Castilian Spanish, which travelled with the Sephardim from Toledo and Cordoba, was now the lingua franca of Ottoman Jewry. It's the Jewish festival of Purim, the feast of Esther. Like Christmas, Purim belongs to children. Games are played, songs are sung, and sticky pastries are eaten. The children of Istanbul's Jewish community are performing in Dostuk, the city's Jewish youth club. That stentorian voice leading them in a traditional Sephardic song belongs to Karen Gershon Sharhon, a professional singer who's also the director of the city's Sephardic Centre. It was established a couple of years ago to celebrate the 500th anniversary of the expulsion from Spain.
The Jews arrived in the Ottoman Empire in 1492. This was after the Inquisition, after the expulsion of the Jews, and they brought with them a certain culture, a certain musical culture as well. But you have to see that throughout more than 500 years, they were living inside the major Turkish culture. And the major culture around them was not just Turkish, but it was Greek as well, and it was the Balkans, it was the Mediterranean, so it was everything mixed together.
As the chair of Dostuk, Lina Filiba explains that the mission of the cultural centre is to promote the survival of tradition, language and culture, and to document the history of the Jewish community.
We live in a very secular country, but we realized that we were losing our grasp in our Jewish identities because we did not know the reason of each tradition. We realized that we need to teach ourselves, we need to teach our children something about the why, something about the how.
Istanbul today has a population of 12 million people. Only 20,000 of them are Jewish, a fraction of 1%. How did the most influential of all Sephardic societies dwindle to a mere handful scattered along the Bosphorus? The tale of the community's decline is a mirror of the decline of the Ottoman Empire itself. For the most part, unlike the tale of the Spanish expulsion, it's not a story of persecution and victimization, although as time wore on, there were plenty of both. The Jewish community was the victim of symbiosis. They were so intricately interwoven with their Ottoman hosts, commercially and politically, that when the Turkish sun began to set, their remarkable achievements also fell into the shadows. We're back in Balat, on the shore of the Golden Horn, on a rusty old iron bridge, the Galata Bridge, which once led to the other original area of settlement, the hamlet of Haskøy. Now, it stops halfway across the Golden Horn. By the early 17th century, both districts were in severe decline. The original inhabitants had mostly migrated into the city proper, and Istanbul was beginning to show the effects of the waning power of the Porte. The first thing to fade was military might. Between the first siege of Vienna in the 16th century and the second 100 years later, the legendary Janissaries lost battle after battle. Their organization disintegrated, and they mutated into corrupt cliques, protecting their dwindling power through conspiracy and extortion.
When came the second phase of stagnation of the Ottoman Empire, by coincidence it's also stagnation of the Jewish community.
Naim Gulerius, chairman of the city's Jewish Museum, sees other reasons within the community for the decline of Ottoman Sepharad.
Because for the Jewish community, there were, after 200 years, there were no more newcomers from Europe, no new ideas, no new skills, no new bringings of knowledge. So it was a period of stagnation, using again the old-fashioned knowledge.
The community huddled in the remaining places of worship, like the Achrida synagogue here, waiting for deliverance. They began to turn to mysticism, to the ancient Kabbalah and the Zohar, both of which had developed during the final desperate days of Spanish Sepharad. Across the empire, a messianic movement developed, with itinerant preachers and scholars proclaiming the end of days. And then, in 1658, a well-built, ruddy-faced man disembarked here on the Golden Horn and announced the imminent arrival of the Saviour. He was a Kabbalistic student with a disturbing track record in bizarre public behaviour. He'd already been expelled from Salonika for pronouncing the secret name of God on the Sabbath. Now in Istanbul, he was attracting disciples in alarming numbers. One of his first acts here was to dress a fish in baby's clothes and perform a messianic ceremony. He explained that the Zohar predicted the arrival of the Messiah under the sign of Pisces. His name was Shabbatai Tzvi. He hailed from the port of Smyrna, or Izmir as we now call it, and his ministry extended to the most remote corners of the Sephardic world. What does the name Smyrna mean to you? A sweeping Aegean seafront, fringed with palms? A teeming port stuffed with spices and precious metals from Asia Minor? A bustling bazaar squeezed into a labyrinth of little alleys opening out into shaded squares where men in tarbushes trade in silks and sip mint tea? Well, there's no shortage of bustle here in the Kemeralty Bazaar. But as for the teeming port, the spices and the silks and the traders, they're a distant Ottoman dream. The great port of Smyrna, controlling the trade from the Maghreb and the Levant, passed into history a century ago. Even the name has changed. Since the creation of the secular state of Turkey after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, legendary Smyrna has been translated into prosaic Izmir. But not everything is lost. As we jostle through the bazaar, there are tiny hints of this city's exotic past. A few crumbling facades and the odd sign clinging to a wall act as reminders that this was once a mystical, learned place which sheltered students of the Talmud and Kabbalah and boasted a Jewish community numbering over 60,000 souls. It's always risky to visit a bazaar alone, and today I have the very best of guides, Daniel Levy.
The name of the street, we crossed the Synagogue Street. So now we turn left and we are now before the old Etz Chaim synagogue.
Why is it called the Synagogue Street?
Because the center of the Jews was there, and there was the center Jewish market.
Daniel is one of the leaders of Izmir's Jewish community. There are less than 2,000 of them today, served by 10 synagogues, of which only 3 are fully functioning. 350 years ago, there were 53 of them, mostly concentrated in this area between the Roman Agora and the seashore. Some of this still survives. Daniel tells me that there are bakeries here which still make unleavened bread for Passover, and a few of the silversmiths and cloth merchants here in the bazaar are Jewish. A little of the devout and mystical tradition of Ottoman Jewry still survives here in the centre of the city. The Shabbat service has just concluded here in the oldest of Izmir's 3 remaining synagogues. We're in the porch, where there's a small breakfast every Saturday after the service. Congregants, almost all of them men, are sipping wine and eating pastries and passing round pieces of bread laced with salt in a traditional gesture of hospitality. The songs and prayers follow the Hispanic rite, and the odd Ladino word filters into the conversation, those fragments of the Judeo-Spanish that was once the lingua franca of the Ottoman world. But for the rest, Jewish Smyrna requires as much archaeology as the Agora up the hill. What remains? Here are the fragments of a house owned by the community, where Jews captured by corsairs were brought to be ransomed. And here is the Signora Geberit Synagogue. The name Signora can only mean one thing. It was founded in the 16th century by Signora Donna Gracia Nasi, the great Sephardic banker and philanthropist. But I'm searching for something else. Somewhere between the fruit stalls and the kelims and the crockery is one of the few remaining sites associated with the false messiah of Smyrna, Shabbatai Tzvi. Here it is, the Salom Synagogue. 2 iron gates with a rusty wrought iron grille above them. Pinned to the walls and spilling onto the pavement outside is a pile of fake Nike trainers. Hardly messianic. I wonder what hides behind those blank and secretive gates.
This synagogue is the synagogue where Shabbatai Tzvi used to be the rabbi and used to practice his theories. And this synagogue is still in use and is opened only on the holidays. Shabbatai Tzvi used to live here, and he was educated as a rabbi, but then he started to learn Kabbalah, and what he learned and the practices that he started to use were not accepted by the community, and he used to leave Izmir. He went to Egypt, to Israel, and then he went back to Istanbul, I think, and he affected the Jewish life all over the world.
As a teenager, he was tormented by erotic visions, and he adopted a regime of discipline and renunciation. In his early 20s, he married twice, but both marriages were unconsummated. Perhaps he was too preoccupied with the Kabbalistic teachings of Isaac Luria and the weird mishmash of revelation, conspiracy, and numerology which accompanied them. Indeed, he was so preoccupied that he seems to have suffered a severe nervous breakdown in his mid-20s, and he retreated into the mountains and caves of Turkey's Aegean provinces, almost certainly without either of his wives. And when he emerged in 1648, it was to proclaim that God had revealed his destiny. He was the Messiah. He'd been anointed by the patriarchs Abraham and Isaac. Now the people of Izmir should fast and pray and prepare for the end of days. And so they did in their thousands. He wasn't an impressive sight. The one unauthenticated portrait we have shows a plump young man in a turban with heavy-lidded eyes and a florid complexion pointing to a passage in a book. His behavior was provocatively strange. Even his final marriage, consummated this time and in full public view, was to a disturbed young woman by the name of Sarah. She was rumoured to be obsessively promiscuous, and some maintained that she'd been a common prostitute. An anonymous French source insisted that in marrying her, Shabbatai was fulfilling the prophecy of Hosea, "Go take unto thee a wife of whoredoms." But women flocked to his side, dressed themselves in white, fasted and scourged themselves. Perhaps the secret of his appeal lies here, in the rundown bazaar of Izmir, or in the ramshackle, shattered communities of Balat and Haskari back in Istanbul, where he eventually fetched up. The Ottoman Empire in 1648 was already set on its slow process of decline, and the Jewish communities were sinking into abject poverty, fertile soil in which to cultivate a messianic movement.
People start studying the Kabbalah, trying to find answers for their situation.
The historian Rena Molcho hails from the city most transformed by Shabbatai, the Greek port of Thessaloniki, or Salonika as it was known in his day.
People pack up all their things, sell their belongings, and try to follow him to the Holy Land. And this creates a big upheaval in the community. Why? Because these people who could afford to study with Shabtai Tzvi, many of these people were of good economical standing, which means the community would lose from the people that would leave those that were providing for the taxes of the poor.
Shabbatai didn't stay long here in Izmir after his messianic revelation. They didn't let him. The elders of the community drove him out, either for pronouncing the forbidden name of God or for encouraging riotous assembly. He set off across the water, first for Salonika, then overland to Greece and Anatolia, and finally back across the Mediterranean to Cairo. And everywhere he planted fresh communities of Sabbatians. While his movement took root in Holland, Germany, Ukraine and Italy, Shabbatai prepared for the apocalypse by encouraging every kind of provocative behaviour. Fasting, breaking dietary taboos, self-mutilation, everything that was guaranteed to upset the Ottoman authorities. His wife joined in enthusiastically. A young doctor's son was brought to Sarah's apartment and instructed to have sex with her. The poor lad fled in terror. Word began to spread that the Sultanate was preparing to put an end to his ministry. In no way discouraged, he decided to confront the Porte face to face, and he sailed once again across these waters to Istanbul. Within days of his arrival, he was imprisoned in Galata and then dragged before the authorities here in Topkapi. Finally, in the Sultan's palace at Edirne, he was offered the choice of conversion to Islam or death. Shabbatai was no common or garden messiah. He chose to convert. A little black comic interlude in the drama of the Ottoman Sephardim? Well, not completely. The followers of Shabbatai, calling themselves Donme, continued to cleave to their bizarre faith wherever they settled. Even here in Istanbul, despite every attempt to suppress the cult. Some say they even exert a secret influence over Turkey today.
They thought that they were running the Turkish economy, which was true in a way.
The writer and political scientist Rifat Bali finds the roots of Sabbatian conspiracy theories in the tensions of 20th century post-Ottoman Turkey.
Because they were well educated, the Islamists thought and still think that Atatürk Mustafa Kemal, born in Salonika, is a Donme. His being a Donme and they believe, his close friends, his colleagues being Donmes, this is not a Turkish republic, this is a Jewish republic.
It seems unlikely that Ataturk was part of a Semitic conspiracy, when at the same time his government was doing their best to reduce the influence of all the Turkish minorities.
They imposed policy of Turkification, which per se is not a bad thing. They wanted to build up a nation where people will say first and foremost, I'm a Turkish citizen, will not say I'm a Jew, I'm an Armenian, I'm a Greek. For them to Turkify the economy means that, as they considered non-Muslims as not real Turks, to transfer the wealth of the non-Muslim bourgeoisie to the Turkish bourgeoisie and create a new Turkish bourgeoisie.
Industrialist Isaac Alaton has bitter personal memories of the impact of the Turkish taxes aimed at minority groups.
It is very true that the Jewish minority, along with the Greek and Armenian minorities, suffered during the time of the wealth tax. And among these, my father, who used to be a very respected businessman, went bankrupt and was broken for the rest of his life. He never recovered from this shock, and he was even taken to the mountain to serve for a whole year, breaking stones in order to pay for his debt.
There was one corner of the Ottoman world which somehow escaped the general disintegration which spread throughout the Balkans during the 19th century. Indeed, it experienced a rebirth. We've been there before, at the very beginning of our journey through Sepharad. Salonika. For 3 centuries, the most prosperous city in the empire, and the most Sephardic. At one time, 2/3 of its population was Jewish. It's time that we return to that remarkable Macedonian port to complete the tale of the Ottoman Sephardim. It's Passover, and Salonika's small but sturdy Sephardic community is in celebratory mood. Tomorrow morning they'll be in the synagogue for the 3rd holiest day of the calendar. But tonight is Seder night. The Seder is the Passover meal that commemorates the biblical exodus from Egypt. As you can hear, they brought the traditions and the melodies of Iberian Jewry with them here to the Balkans. And, of course, the food. Now, tell me about this fish. You made this.
Want you to try it?
I will, yes, but tell me about it first.
You fry it. You put it aside, and in the place you will cook it, you put vinegar, salt of course, and egozim, chestnut.
Chestnuts?
Yes.
Really?
Yes, chestnut, many.
You can follow the whole history of Sephardic Salonika here in the Jewish Museum round the corner. It was founded 8 years ago in one of the few buildings of the old Jewish quarter to survive the Great Fire which swept over the lower part of town in 1917. According to my guidebook, on the ground floor are a handful of tombstones with inscriptions in Ladino, which were rescued from the former Jewish cemetery. The ancient necropolis was on the other side of town. It was destroyed in 2 waves, a wave of neglect when this city was Hellenized after the First Balkan War, and a wave of malicious destruction during the Nazi occupation. It's closed today for Passover, but the director, Erika Pariah Zamur, has offered me a private journey through the story of the most prosperous and successful city of the Sephardic diaspora.
The fact that the Jews in Thessaloniki were invited here, it was very important because they always lived in very good terms with the Turks. They always lived free. They were never put in ghettos. They could profess any profession and all the professions they wanted. And this was a small paradise.
Today's community still speak of the Golden Age before the Second World War, while the older members still hark back to the 19th century, when the city of Salonika was celebrated throughout the world for its culture and commercial prosperity. Those like Erika, who were born since 1945, have largely accepted that they live in the Hellenic city of Thessaloniki.
At that moment, big, wealthy Jewish families come from Italy, here in Thessaloniki, with names like Alatini, Mondiano, Fernandez, and they built modern factories, and there is a renaissance of the economic life.
There's precious little in contemporary Thessaloniki to recall the teeming life of old Salonika. Most of the buildings were swept away in that last and most terrible conflagration in 1917, when 70,000 people were left homeless and 37 synagogues were destroyed. You can glimpse a few of the old Ottoman caravanserai with their rickety upper stories and crumbling lodges between Modiano Market and Egnatia Boulevard. There's a cut-price shoe shop where they used to stall the donkeys, and a heap of bird cages under the vines on the other side of the alley. But if you want to conjure up the rich and complex history of the place, you must go to the archives and the literature, and above all the music which rang out when these tavernas throbbed with Sephardic life. That song was called Primavera in Salonico, Spring in Salonika. In spring in Salonika, at Mazlum's Cafe, I found a dark-eyed lass singing and playing the lute. I'm afraid there are no dark-eyed lasses in Mazlum's Cafe today. There's no cafe. It burned down in the fire of 1917. It was replaced by the Hotel Méditerranée, but that's vanished as well. Sitting here, drinking in the comfortable coffee bars under the arcades in Aristotle Square, you'd be hard-pushed to find any trace of the street life or the commercial prosperity of 19th century Salonika. And what consigned them to the mists of memory wasn't simply the fire. It was a unique process of ethnic cleansing. It had its roots in the nationalism that was burgeoning throughout the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1870s and 80s. While the smaller Balkan nations struggled for self-determination, captains of commerce like Modiano and Alatini hitched their staff firmly to the Ottoman caravan. So, when Ottoman Salonika was handed over to the newly enlarged nation of Greece in 1912, after the First Balkan War, an early casualty was the Sephardic community. In Hellenized Thessaloniki, Greek was immediately made compulsory in all schools, and slowly the Ladino language that had been preserved for half a millennium began to wither away. When the fire swept through the Jewish quarters, it destroyed more than simply schools and synagogues and places of business.
The purpose of the Greek state, liberated in quotes, was to Hellenize the city.
For Rena Molcho, the removal of Ottoman history stole her very identity.
One way of Hellenizing the city is falsifying the history. This is the answer. Now, when you become an adult, you start having problems with your identity. So my identity was defined in a sense that I knew what I was not, but I did not know what I was.
I've returned to the crossroads of Ignati and Venizelos, where I started this journey through Sepharad. It looks different now. It's a crossroads leading nowhere in particular. Forget about Jewish history for a moment. Islam has been completely airbrushed out of the city's story. The crumbling Hamza Bey Mosque behind me, with its torn posters and rusty scaffolding, has been stripped of its dignity. I have a guidebook here, Monuments of Thessaloniki. It's 156 pages long, and there isn't a single mention of the ruined mosques and hammams that survive in the centre of the city. The guidebook has a 25-page history of the city. The 500 years of Ottoman rule are consigned to 2 paragraphs. The bitter resentment of Salonika's Ottoman past continued to stain relations with the Jews throughout the 20s and 30s. Nationalist newspapers accused them of preserving an Ottoman mentality. Elements of anti-Semitism began to creep into the culture of the city. In 1928, they published that notorious forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Its sinister hints of Semitic conspiracies for world domination played well with a population who could still remember the powerful Jewish commercial aristocracy of the 1890s.
The only way for Salonika to be Hellenized was when the Jewish community was destroyed. It was by law enforced that the Jews learn Greek in the Alliance schools. In 1932, Papanastasiou, who was the Minister of Education, forbade all elementary schools to teach a foreign language. And kids had to learn only Greek.
In 1939, there were a little short of 50,000 Jews living here in Thessaloniki, a shadow of the numbers 50 years earlier, when more than half the population was Jewish, but compared to other parts of the former Ottoman Empire, a respectable total, sufficient to retain tradition, some language, and the handful of synagogues which survived or were rebuilt after the Great Fire. Then, on the 9th of April 1941, the Axis powers marched into Thessaloniki. Although Greece was technically under Italian control, Thessaloniki was occupied by German troops. They were puzzled by the relaxed attitude of the Greek government towards its minorities. One German officer asked a local official to direct him to the ghetto. The official replied that he'd been studying the history of the city for 20 years and he'd never heard mention of such a place. Over the following months, the fascist allies argued uneasily about what to do with the Jews. Even after the Wannsee conference, when the final solution was finally agreed, the Italians managed to persuade the Nazis that yellow stars and mass expropriation were unnecessary. But here, in Eleftheriou Square, between the old Jewish quarter and the misty waterfront, on July the 8th, 1942, the German government gained the upper hand. Platea Eleftheriou, Freedom Square. Perhaps it's just as well that it's been left to its own devices and turned into a car park. Because here, the city's adult male Jewish population were rounded up and detailed for forced labor. The Salonika Genocide had begun.
In Salonika, people didn't think it was possible.
The family of bookseller Maya Mocho experienced at first hand the way that Salonika's Jewish community sleepwalked towards their fate.
They had not encountered anti-Semitism before. It was something that was happening to others. I mean, when you hear about a murder, it's something that happens to somebody else anyhow. So they didn't have the right defenses. That's why it is such a shocking thing in reality.
On the 6th of February 1943, the SS installed themselves in a suburban villa. They informed the chief rabbi, Koretz, that all clubs and associations were to be closed, all Jews were to wear the yellow star, mark their shops, and move into a ghetto. 5 weeks later, the order was issued to deport the entire population to Krakow. The following day, the first trains departed. By the end of the year, 95% of Thessaloniki's Jewish population had perished in Auschwitz and Treblinka. 5 centuries of Sephardic Salonika were brought to a brutal close.
Dame la mano, paloma, me subiré a tu nido, maldicha que duerme sola, yo voy a dormir contigo. Maldicha que duerme sola.
But not quite. We're in the Saul Modiano Old People's Home. Singing that ancient Ladino ballad was Bienvenida Mano, now in her 80s, and living once again in the Jerusalem of the Balkans. She was one of 2,000 Jews who escaped the Holocaust, spirited abroad or hidden by Greek patriots, some of them in this very city. Her survival is an extraordinary tale. She was one of thousands of young women subjected to medical experiment by Mengele's team of perverted scientists.
Bienvenida was in Birkenau, and after that in Auschwitz, in the Block 10.
The director of the Old People's Home, Victoria Benoziglio, has recorded Benvenida's story.
Doctors make experiments there to make her infertile, but it was there a doctor, Jewish doctor, assistant of the German doctors, that helps very much.
When the Nazi commanders discovered what was happening, they took the doctor away and shot him. Benvenida was still just alive when Auschwitz was finally liberated. But every bit as extraordinary is the survival of Jewish life in the city after the war.
Ya salió de la mar la galana, ya salió de la mar la galana, con un vestido ali blanco, ya salió de la mar.
I'm here with Professor Sam Armitstead and Dr. Hilary Pomeroy. Sam is a world expert on medieval Spanish poetry and a one-man encyclopedia of Ladino literature. Hilary runs a special course in Judeo-Espanol at London University. They're collecting ballads and cantigas with the residents of the home. Songs about moors and maidens and castles and fig trees in a Spain which most of them have never seen. Very sadly, Bienvenida died a few months after that recording was made. But this spiritual Spain stays alive in the imagination. So it did for more than 3 centuries, despite the auto-da-fés and the forced conversions and the grinding poverty of the declining years of Ottoman rule here in the city known as Mother in Israel. The Sephardim of Salonika have rebuilt their community with dogged pride, endowing this old people's home and the museum, restoring the synagogues, and clinging tenaciously to the melodies, the traditions, and the food which still conjure up that vanished Iberian dream. And if they've never known Toledo or Cordoba or Seville, nor have they followed their fellow Salonicans to that other Jerusalem, not the Jerusalem of the Balkans, but the Holy City itself. They might have done after the war, when the State of Israel was created as a homeland for survivors of the genocide, which was the fate of 45,000 of their fellow citizens.
We have nothing after the war. Nothing. No homes, no dresses, no money, no relatives, no. We have not families.
The vice chairman of the Salonika Jewish community, Jackie Ben Mayor, watched his parents' generation embrace amnesia.
Since neither the state nor the community did anything to promote, let's say, or to enhance the experience of the story, the history of the Jewish presence in Salonika, so they tried to integrate better in the society, and some of them thought that the only way to integrate is forget.
Now I am very, very happy and proud when I see my grandchildren, when I see my home full again. No one can understand that. For us, it's a big, big miracle.
So is Salonika the semicolon in the Sephardic story? Not quite. It's still Passover. We're still eating unleavened bread in commemoration of that first diaspora in biblical Egypt. Remember that when the Ottoman crescent moon rose over the Balkans, its light also shone in the Levant. Even the walls of Jerusalem were built by Suleiman the Magnificent. So when, at the end of the Seder, the Jews of Salonika sang the words L'Sholah Haba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, for 3 Ottoman centuries, they lived in a world where that dream might have become a reality.
The Sublime Porte was written and presented by Dennis Marks, with technical presentation by Tim Alcock and Tony Wass. The Search for Sepharad was a director's cut production for BBC Radio 3.